Hi, in this video we are going to write a VBA code for a pivot table. For that we have a sample data in this Excel. So first let's insert a pivot table for this data, and I'm going to choose all the fields under the row labels. I'm just selecting it. Okay, so here if you look at the by default, it actually list out all the fields below that, not in a tabular format. So if you want to change it into the tabular format, what you have to do is manually you have to go to each fields and you have to do few changes, like show this label in the tabular format, and if you want to repeat the item labels, you can check this and you can say okay. So now you will see that the first student name is listed under the tabular format. So similarly, if you want to do it for all the rest of the fields, it's a time consuming one. You have to do it manually by going through this path. So just consider, here we have around 7 fields, okay, and you have to do it everything manually. And just think about having a multiple fields, more than 100 fields. It's going to be a very difficult task to convert a field to tabular format manually. It's going to be a time consuming one. So that's why we are going to write a VBA coding to automate these kind of process. So with this tutorial, it will give you an idea how to write a VBA coding in pivot table, and from there you can take forward to any extent. Okay, so now what we will do is I have written a sample coding which is going to be we are going to use it. Okay, so here what we are doing is, if you look at the steps here, I'm just assigning a string, and I'm saying that there is a pivot field. The pivot field, what we represent is, this is the pivot field. Student ID, student name, so each one is a pivot field. It says field. Okay, so I'm declaring a pivot field here, and I'm saying that active cell dot pivot field. So whenever I select a pivot field, whichever the pivot field, for example here I'm using this particular pivot, and I can insert another pivot field in the same sheet, and I can place another pivot table here. So we need to understand which pivot table I want to change. So for that I am using this particular active cell. So choose the cell and you will understand which pivot table you are talking about. So I'm choosing this active cell dot pivot field, so that I can identify which pivot table we are talking about and which pivot field I have to select. So if P is nothing, that means let's say I am trying to run a macro by selecting something which is not a pivot table. Like here I am selecting a D cell, which is not a pivot table, and trying to execute that VBA coding. It cannot actually identify which field I'm talking about, whether I'm talking about this pivot table or this pivot table. So this is a coding to ensure that the coding runs properly. Okay, so only if the active pivot table is selected, then I want to execute few steps. So let's say if the active cell in the pivot table is not selected, then I will say that select a field in pivot table to change the entire pivot table to the tabular format. So it will give a message that you are not selected any field in the pivot table. So if I have selected a pivot table cell, then what I have to do is I have to just pick the pivot table name, and this is what we are saying: active sheet, whichever this pivot table I have selected, active sheet, and inside that, and get the pivot table name. So once you get the pivot table name, so what is meant by the pivot table name, you can see that each pivot table have a pivot table name. You can change this name. So by default, if you see that this pivot table name is pivot table 2 and this pivot table name is pivot table 3. So we are trying to find which pivot table we are supposed to work. And once we find out which this is a pivot table I'm supposed to work, then I can loop through each fields. I can either I can actually get into each fields in the entire sheet. Otherwise I can just go through the each row fields only. So that's what we are doing here. So just loop through all the fields, row fields dot count. That means I'm going to move I'm going to loop through each fields here, and I'm going to select it's row fields. Row fields means I'm going to go through the fields which are actually listed down here, only those fields which are listed down here. So if I remove max, okay, only these fields, max is not be included. Okay, so I'm going to loop through all the row fields. I'm going to take each fields now. So for each field I'm going to do the tabular format change. So this is the coding that I really want. I want to know what I am supposed to do. Once I get into the actual row field, I want to change the format to tabular format. So what is the coding that I am supposed to do? So maybe it's a tricky part. A simple way to find out what coding I am supposed to write here. Okay, we can use a macro recording and we can find out the coding. So what you can do is just go to the Excel. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to revert back all the changes. Okay, so now it's actually back to the same status, and what we are going to do is we have to go to the developer tab and record the macro. Okay, I'm just recording a macro. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to change this row field to the tabular format, so that whatever the changes that I'm doing here, it will be written as a code. So I've done the changes to tabular format. I'm just saying okay. Now I see that it's been changed, so I'm going to stop the recording. This is the coding that I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to view the actual VBA coding. So go to the macros. This is the coding that we have. It's been recorded. Click on the edit and you will see that this is the coding that we want. Just copy that coding, and this is what we need. Okay, this is the simplest way to understand and find out a few data, to actually write a code. Otherwise it's very hard to use Google. You have to use the Google and you have to be smart in understanding each VBA coding. So here you just need to tweak the coding. So what you have to do is, it says as active cell dot pivot tables of pivot table 2. So it knows that I have selected the pivot table here. But in VBA coding, you cannot actually know that this is a table that I'm going to use. So that's where we have an option to find this. So we can just replace that hard-coded pivot table name into the actual format. So here there's another option here. I'm going to change it. So S is a row field. Student ID we have selected. So we can replace this with active sheet pivot table of pivot table name dot row fields of that particular index dot name. So it gives that student ID. It loops through each fields. So I can just say I can use that variable here. Similarly, here I can use the same thing. And if you look at, I've changed that dot layout format to tabular. That's what I have done when I record the macro, and I have set the repeat labels as true. So this is the actual code. So I hope we have the expected coding here. So let's use this particular module. Copy this. So we are going to execute this in the VBA coding in the Excel. So just open the Excel, and what we can do is we can just press Alt F11, or otherwise you can use Visual Basic Editor. So this is a coding we have. So what we can do is we can replace the coding here, and we can execute it. So I think this should work fine. We don't see any issues. So once that active cell is selected, it will get into this particular for loop. First it will get the what is a pivot table name, and then it will loop through each row fields, and inside each row fields selected, it changes the layout to tabular format, and repeat labels is equal to true. If nothing is selected, if no cell is selected in the pivot table, then it will say you please select a particular cell in the pivot table. So this is a expected coding, so we should be fine. It is now asking to save it. Just cancel it. You can just file, close. You don't need to save it, just for demo purpose. So what we are going to do is we are going to change the entire the row fields into the tabular format. Okay, so let's try to run the macros now. Click on the macro, select and run. So now you see that everything is changes. So it reduces the huge time, and it is called automation. So automation in pivot table is possible through VBA coding. Hope this is helpful to expand your knowledge on VBA coding in pivot table. Thanks for watching.